Hello, I'm Natalie Zett, and welcome to Flower in the River. This podcast, inspired by my book of the same name, explores the 1915 Eastland disaster in Chicago and its enduring impact, particularly on my family's history. We'll explore the intertwining narratives of others impacted by this tragedy as well, and we'll dive into writing and genealogy and uncover the surprising supernatural elements that surface in family history research. Come along with me on this journey of discovery. Hey everyone, this is Natalie, and welcome to episode 90 of Flower in the River podcast. I appreciate you joining me on this journey, and we'll jump right in because, as always, there's a lot to get through. So, in my latest weekly research adventure, I've uncovered some more remarkable stories that should be brought to light. To date, they really haven't. So today, we're going to discuss several lives and focus on a couple of stories that I've uncovered. First of all, we'll dive into the lives of two Eastland rescuers whose bravery and actions have largely been ignored in historical accounts. First of all, there's J.A. Rusk. We'll return to him because he has a very fascinating story. And then there's Robert F. Snyder, a 19-year-old machinist apprentice whose courage during the chaos saved lives, including his sweethearts. And his sweetheart would be Bessie Straan. She survived, but faced unimaginable loss when one of her sisters perished, while she and another sister survived. To begin, I want to honor someone who played a pivotal role that day, but seems to be overlooked by the narratives that I've researched to date. His name is John A. Rusk. He was a produce merchant whose business sat practically in the shadow of the Eastland disaster. Rusk and his team were vital in the immediate rescue and recovery efforts. His store was even used as a temporary staging area for victims. Rusk's obituary, published decades later, speaks of a man deeply rooted in his community and committed to helping others, a quote-unquote colorful figure of the South Water Street market and a quiet hero of the Eastland disaster. His death notice is in a somewhat obscure paper. It's called the Oak Leaves sometimes, and it is from Oak Park, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago, and this is from the October 18th, 1943 issue. This is his obituary. J.A. Rusk, 40-year resident, dies. John A. Rusk of 821 South Grove, for 40 years a resident of Oak Park, died suddenly early on Tuesday morning at his home of a heart attack. Born on a farm in Rutland, Illinois in 1868, Mr. Rusk came to Chicago as a young man and established a produce commission business on the Old South Water Market. The tragic Eastland disaster took place in the Chicago River, virtually at Mr. Rusk's back door. He and his men assisted in the rescue of many of the victims, and his store was commandeered to make a place for the bodies of those who lost their lives in the sinking. A colorful figure in the wholesale market for nearly half a century, Mr. Rusk remained active to the end. Surviving is his widow, Bessie E. Rusk, two daughters, Mrs. Robert Davis and Mrs. Fern Wilson of Oak Park, a son, John R. Rusk, Jr. of Oak Park, a brother, David, and a sister, Mrs. Mary O'Shea of Chicago, 7 grandchildren and 1 great-grandchild. Services at the Postal Wait Chapel will take place at 3 o'clock today, Thursday, and interment will follow at Forest Home. A little bit more about John Rusk. He was born to Irish immigrants in Chicago in 1868, or some sources say 1869. He married Bessie Robbins in 1899, and his job in the census was often listed as a merchant. And by 1910, he was living in Oak Park, so I think he was doing very well in his business. I did find this advertisement in a 1913 issue of Oak Leaves. It says, John A. Rusk, commission merchant, 264 West South Water Street, Chicago. And it says Southern fruits and vegetables, a specialty. So I had to do some research because the world of vegetables and merchants and such, I really don't know anything about this. But I learned that a commission merchant is someone who sells goods on behalf of others and earns a commission from those sales. That makes sense, right? So in the early 1900s, especially in trade hubs like Chicago, commission merchants played a pivotal role in the distribution of goods. We're speculating here, but I'm guessing that John A. Rusk, and they already made him sound like a character, he would have been deeply involved in the produce markets of that era. Chicago's South Water Street was a central hub for produce trading, bustling with activity as goods arrived by rail and were distributed throughout the city. Can you imagine what that was like? Whoa. Commission merchants like Rusk facilitated the movement of fresh produce from suppliers to retailers, ensuring that the city's markets remained well-stocked. This system, I learned, was essential for the efficient distribution of perishable goods, especially in a rapidly growing city like Chicago was at that point. Commission merchants' expertise in market trends and pricing was invaluable to both producers and consumers. And I have the feeling that John A. Rusk was not a pushover, so he probably faced down some difficult situations in his life in terms of his business. However, the other thing I was thinking about is that with many obituaries of folks that I have located in the last 12 months or so, a lot of times the Eastland disaster is not mentioned. In John's obituary, it is mentioned, so obviously it was a story he told to his wife, his family, and probably anybody who was around. It was important to him. It probably helped shape who he was. And so I'm grateful to have found this obituary. Again, I've never seen his name in any of the records, historical records, or websites that are about the Eastland disaster or even George Hilton's book, because George couldn't get everybody in there. So John Rusk's life and legacy reminds us that not all heroes are on the front page or etched in memorials. But for goodness sake, I want to make sure that everyone is remembered in this, because this is just startling to me that so many of these stories are on the verge of disappearing. And sometimes, like John's story, they are tucked away in forgotten obituaries, and they're waiting for someone to find them. They're waiting to be discovered. When I spoke with Hank Z. Jones, the genealogist and actor and all-around Renaissance person, he said, they're waiting for you. They're waiting to be discovered. And I have seen nothing so far in my journey with the people of the Eastland that would disabuse me of Hank Z. Jones' statement. They absolutely are waiting. So with that, we're going to go back to July 24th, 1915, and we're going to look through the eyes of Robert Snyder as his incredible first-hand account takes us right into the heart of that tragic day. Imagine this: chaos on the water, screams piercing the air, and debris floating everywhere. Amid this nightmare, a young man fights against fear, exhaustion, and danger, not only to save himself, but to pull others from the brink. His courage and his love in the face of this horrible catastrophe, paints a portrait of heroism that demands to be remembered. So let's remember Robert's story by letting him tell you in his own words what happened that day. This article appeared in the Grand Forks Daily Herald on July 27th, 1915. So that's just a few days after the Eastland disaster. "19-year-old boy is one of the heroes of the Eastland wreck." One of the heroes of the day was Robert F. Snyder, only 19 years old, a machinist apprentice. Young Snyder had a day off. He took his sweetheart, Miss Bessie Straan, on the excursion, and they were together on the north side of the steamer as she made her fateful plunge. Together, they were thrown into the water. When they came up, young Snyder saw her and promptly swam for her. Before he was through his rescue work, he had saved her and 4 other struggling women, 5 in all, and tried to save 2 more. Here is his own story in his own words. "We were thrown under the boat when she capsized. As soon as I began to rise, I swam to the top of the water and saw Bessie. I swam to her and called to her to hold on to me. I caught her between my legs and swam toward the boat with my arms. It wasn't very far. Just as I got started, 2 women who were struggling in the water saw me. They grabbed me around the neck and held me pretty tight, so tight that they dragged me under the water. We were down several minutes, 2 or 3, I should say. I had to hold my breath pretty tight. The 2 women were pretty well excited, but Bessie was calm. She made no fuss and held tight to my legs. I managed to fight my way to the top of the water, and I came up right close to the boat. I saw a board, one of those that holds the life preservers, to the top of the deck. It was sort of pointing out, and I managed to catch hold of it. I worked pretty hard and raised the 3 girls to the top of the water with the aid of this board, and then I caught hold of a long piece of hose that ran along the side of the deck, and the girls caught this too and held on. We all kind of rested, and when I got my strength back a little, I raised them to the side of the boat. They managed to get on the side, and then I dropped under the water, as I was pretty well exhausted. But I am a water rat. I was raised in New York alongside the East River, and I'm used to the water, so I soon recovered my strength. When I came up, I saw Miss Martha Strowski, a friend of Bessie's, struggling in the water. I saw her go down, and I went down after her a few feet, but couldn't see her under the water. When I rose, she was gone. I don't know whether she escaped or not, as she seemed to go under the stern of the boat. I looked for her, but could not see her again. Then, as I was on the surface, I saw 2 women alongside me. They were in the water under the top deck of the boat, which was clear of the river. They saw me and struggled to grab me. We were very close to the boat, not over a yard or so, I should say. I noticed that one of these women had a gash over her left eye from which blood was flowing. I went down under the water and under the woman, and as I came up, I caught her around the waist. The other woman slipped away from me and sank. She must have drowned. The woman I grabbed, I raised to the surface, and then I yelled for help as my strength was pretty well gone. A man lifted her out of the water onto the side of the boat, but said to me that I was strong enough to get out alone, and I guess I was, for I managed to raise myself to the side of the boat and climbed on it. Then I tried to find Bessie's sister, Miss Grace Straan, who, with her other sister, Clara Straan, who was saved, was also aboard.
but I could not find her. I then tried to help the men who were pulling people out of the water, and I did manage to raise the other woman who was in the water at the side of the boat and get her on the boat. By that time, though, I was feeling pretty weak. My strength was about gone, and I was afraid that Bessie might catch a bad cold if she kept standing there. So I went to the dock and took Bessie to my home on a streetcar. We were pretty wet, but some women on the car wrapped her in paper, and one of them gave her a dry coat to cover her.
I didn't need anything as I'm used to being wet.
And then tonight, I don't feel much the worse for my ducking.
Again,
This was from the Grand Forks Herald, date July 27th, 1915.
so what happened with all of these people after the Eastland disaster? Well, we'll get into that, but let's learn a little bit more about Robert Snyder and about Bessie Straan. Robert was born in Brooklyn, New York on February 16, 1896. His parents were also born in the United States, but his family roots trace back to Ireland and Germany. At just 19 years old, Robert was carving out a life for himself in Chicago. Then there's Bessie Straan. She was born in Chicago on April 25, 1892, to parents who had immigrated from Bohemia, now called the Czech Republic. At the time of the Eastland disaster, as pointed out, Robert and Bessie were sweethearts. They were on the steamer together when it capsized. Robert's quick thinking and bravery saved Bessie's life, along with several others. And we'll talk about those others in a few seconds. Their story, fortunately, didn't end with the Eastland. Just over a year later, on August 27, 1916, Robert and Bessie married. Their story, forged in the chaos and heartbreak of one of Chicago's darkest days, is a beautiful reminder of the power of love and hope. According to Robert's draft registration card from June 5, 1917, the couple was living in Chicago's back-of-the-yards neighborhood. Robert was a machinist working for the International Harvester Company, and he was the sole provider for his father, mother, and his wife. I want to talk a little bit about International Harvester because it figures prominently in Chicago's history at the turn of the 20th century. If you know Chicago's history, you've heard of International Harvester. International Harvester was a giant in the industrial world, and its roots run deep in Chicago. The company was formed in 1902 in Chicago when McCormick Harvesting Machine Company, founded by Cyrus McCormick, inventor of the mechanical reaper, merged it with Deering Harvester Company and a few smaller firms. International Harvester became a powerhouse in agricultural machinery. They produced everything from tractors to trucks. Their McCormick's Work Factory on the South Side was a massive operation, churning out equipment that revolutionized farming across the globe. FYI, my grandmother, Annie Pfeiffer, before she worked for Western Electric, she worked for McCormick. According to the stories my grandmother shared with her daughter, my Aunt Pearl, she much preferred working for Western Electric. Who knows why? Back to International Harvester. It was not just about what it was doing, it was a lifeline for Chicago's working class. Thousands of immigrants from Eastern and Central Europe, among others, found work in its factories, shaping the neighborhoods like Back of the Yards and Bridgeport. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing, by no means. There were labor strikes and union battles that were part of the story. But International Harvester also stood out for backing progressive worker policies like the 8-hour workday. Well, by the mid-20th century, the company faced tough times. Eventually, the agricultural division was sold, and International Harvester evolved into what we now know as Navistar International. But the legacy of those Chicago factories is still woven into the city's industrial history. So when we talk about Robert, this young apprentice at this industrial giant, we're placing him and his family at the heart of Chicago's working class story. He was surrounded by the grit and determination that defined and created this city. By 1920, Robert was still working at International Harvester, and he and Bessie had welcomed their first child, Robert Jr. But by 1930, life had changed. Robert had taken a job as a machinist with the railroad, and the family moved to 5340 South Hermitage Avenue, still in the back of the yards. By then, they had a daughter, Julie, in addition to Robert Jr. By 1944, the family had relocated one more time to a house in the Morgan Park neighborhood on Chicago's far southwest side, and this is known for its rich history and strong community ties. That year marked a tragic loss for the family, though. Bessie passed away. By then, Robert Jr., their son, was serving in the Army, and Julie, their daughter, was married with a child of her own. Robert lived on for many years, eventually moving to Tacoma, Washington, where he spent the last 17 years of his life. He passed away in 1967 at the age of 71. His obituary mentions his two children, Robert Jr., who moved to Los Angeles, and his daughter, now Julie K. Jeffries, who remained in Chicago. He was also survived by his sister, Loretta, and 5 grandchildren. His body was brought back to Chicago for services and burial, closing the final chapter of his life. Let's talk about Bessie's sisters. So for Bessie, she wasn't the only member of her family aboard the Eastland that day. Her sisters were with her as well. What became of them is another chapter that we need to uncover. Clara Straan, who accompanied Robert and Bessie on the Eastland, was born on February 27, 1897, in Chicago. Tragically, she died just over a year after the Eastland disaster on September 27, 1916, at the age of 19. I'm still searching, but I want to know what was the cause of her death. Could it be because she was in the Chicago River for so long that she became ill? During my research, I have found that this happened more often than one may think, although such cases are rarely, if ever, included when the Eastland story is told. Clara is buried in Resurrection Cemetery in Justice, Illinois, a place I know quite well because it's literally sharing the same ground with Bethania Cemetery, where so many of my relatives, including my Aunt Martha, are buried. Now, Grace Straan. Grace Straan was born on July 5th, 1900 in Chicago, and she died on the Eastland at just 15 years old. I'm going to read her obituary from the July 31st, 1915 Chicago Tribune. This will give you an idea of what was going on with that family as well. Straan. Miss Grace Straan, 15 years old, 5339 South Hermitage Avenue, was with her 2 older sisters, Clara and Bessie, on the Eastland. She was not employed at the Western Electric Company plant. In addition to the 2 unmarried sisters named, she is survived by her father, James Straan, husband of the late Catherine Straan, née Alesic, 2 sisters, Mary and Anna, and 3 brothers, John, James, and Stanley. Funeral services were held Thursday, July 29th, from the residence, followed by High Mass at St. Cyrilla's Church and interment at Resurrection Cemetery. A little bit about this church. Any of us with Eastern European lineage background know of Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius. And this was predominantly a Czech church, and it was a historic church of the Roman Catholic Diocese in Chicago. It was located at 5009 South Hermitage Avenue, so it sounds like it was very close to their home. It was built in 1913, and it predominantly served a Bohemian congregation for decades until the archdiocesan budget cuts in 1900 led to the church being closed. It's a beautiful structure, and I will share it in my poster that I make for each episode. Sorry that it closed. It sounds like it was a place that brought people together. So, what do you say about something like this? Well, the Eastland disaster forever altered the lives of witnesses, rescuers, survivors, and families of those who were killed. For J.A. Rusk, John Rusk, who assisted in the rescue, it made enough of an impact on him and his family to include that detail in his obituary. Since he's not mentioned anywhere else that I could find, I'm so grateful to have located this obituary. For Robert Snyder, what can I say? I'm just grateful to have found his story and to share it, since it too is not mentioned in any of the historical records that I could find. As you know, it's always best to let interview subjects speak for themselves, right? As for Robert and Bessie, the chaos of that day marked the beginning of a love story that would endure decades of challenges, more loss, and change. From their humble beginnings in Chicago's working-class neighborhoods to their growing families, their lives were etched by this tragedy, and we'll never know if or how they talked about it as the years passed. But I do see a pattern of, fortitude and determination that defines so many of those people of that era, and that's based not just on my family story, but it's the story or stories of everyone who was affected by the Eastland disaster. And they deserve to be mentioned, and their stories deserve to be told because they were there. John Rusk, Robert Snyder, Bessie Straan, Clara Straan, and Grace Straan. All of their stories are intertwined with Chicago's industrial rise and immigrant history, and they provide a deeply personal glimpse into the lives of those who shaped the city's fabric. Their experiences remind all of us that history is not just a series of events, but a collection of lives, lived with courage, love, and perseverance, even in the face of unimaginable tragedy. Please take care of yourselves and each other, and remember to dive into your own family history. And I'm going to let you in on a little secret. If you do that, you not only contribute to your history, to your family's history, but engaging with it changes you as well. What, you don't believe me? Okay, maybe you'll believe Captain Olivia Benson, a.k.a. Mariska Hargitay. She says, "I think the gift of letting someone tell their story may be the most grace-filled gift we can give." Hey, that's it for this episode, and thanks for coming along for the ride. Please subscribe or follow so you can keep up with all the episodes. And for more information, please go to my website. That's www.flowerintheriver.com. I hope you'll consider buying my book, available as audiobook, ebook, paperback, and hardcover, because I still owe people money. And that's my running joke. But the one thing I'm serious about is that this podcast and my book are dedicated to the memory of all who experienced the Eastland disaster of 1915. Goodbye for now.